focus our attention on what sustainability means, because these days virtually everybody says that they're in favour of sustainability. Even the most improbable people are now heard of that phrase. And its currency has, I think, been devalued by constant use and misuse. So I wanted to focus your attention on what a sustainable future means by doing an exercise called negative brainstorming. So I wanted you to imagine for a moment that we've been asked by the Commonwealth Government's new Commission for Unsustainable Futures to give them some recommendations of policy settings that could ensure that our future was unsustainable. Now, you may think it improbable that any government would set out to create an unsustainable future, but bear with me for a few minutes while I go through this hypothetical exercise. I imagined that I'd been commissioned in good faith, and so I took the commission seriously. And I thought about how we could ensure that our future was not sustainable. As John Coulter has spelled out, having an exponentially growing population is a very good starting point, because we know from biology that no species can increase its population without limit in a closed system. If our population isn't brought into balance by socially acceptable measures, it will eventually be stabilised by starvation and disease and fighting amongst ourselves. And most of us would want a better future than that for our children. So we'll start with an exponentially growing population. How could we compound the effect of a growing population? Well, we could have increasing consumption per person. In fact, we could celebrate increasing consumption per person as a measure of material well-being, and take pride in the fact that not only are there more of us each year, but we are each on average consuming more per person. We could deplete significant mineral resources. Oil would be a good one to start with, and you could ensure that this had the maximum disruptive effect by developing a transport system that's implicitly based on the notion that there will always be cheap oil. You could overuse renewable resources like fisheries and forests and water. You could do environmental damage. Disrupting the global climate would be a good place to start, but maybe you could also precipitate a major loss of biological diversity. As an economic strategy, perhaps you could export raw materials and import elaborately transformed manufactures, and reach a situation where I think we've now had 6 years of consecutive trade deficits without ever getting it right once. You would have thought by now somebody would have noticed, but you could celebrate this strategy of being a quarry for China and a holiday resort for Japan, and run down tariffs to ensure that our economic decline is hastened, to produce social disruptiveness and make us a less cohesive society, widen the inequality between the haves and the have-nots. Perhaps you could embrace globalisation to ensure that the wage rates in labour-intensive areas are driven down to compete with third-world sweatshops, and managerial salaries are inflated to telephone numbers to give us the standards of managerial excellence that we see in such organisations as HAH and OneTel. And you could exacerbate the effects of a widening inequality in income by steadily running down the public provision of essential services like education, health and transport in favour of a private provider model, so that the more affluent have more choices and those with slimmer wallets have fewer choices. And perhaps as a spiritual basis for your society, you could embrace materialism. Now, I'm sure it's apparent to most of you that I'm not describing the hypothetical policy settings in some imaginary banana monarchy in the South Pacific, but the policy settings which an observer from another galaxy would see if they came on an inspection visit to our sovereign state at this time. And I think they would conclude that despite the appearance that we're an intelligent and inventive species who were quite thoughtful, we either somehow hadn't noticed that what we were doing was unsustainable, or perhaps even more worryingly, were too greedy and short-sighted to care. Our present strategy is based on depleting significant resources, creating serious environmental problems, doing nothing about our economic viability, reducing equity and consequent social instability, and a situation in which the decline of traditional religions have left a cultural and spiritual vacuum which is no foundation for the future. Our situation is a bit like this. Our leaders are looking ahead at the shiny road, but there's a very serious problem coming up behind. And if you can't read the fine print, it says objects in the mirror are closer than they appear. The bottom line is that our present course is unsustainable, and that's not a new insight. The second report in the UNEP series on the global environmental outlook said that 7 years ago. It said postponing action is no longer an option, although of course it's still the most common strategy of our leaders, what Sir Humphrey called the strategy of masterly inaction. Let me go through each of those issues briefly. Let me first talk about resources. This is a map of the discovery of large oil fields, and for those of us fitted with normal perceptual apparatus, it's clear that there was a bit of a peak sometime about 40 years ago and a significant decline since. If you look at past oil production and forecasts for Australia and the world, Australian oil production has peaked and is now significantly declining. And again, you would think if governments were looking ahead, they'd be worried about the large and increasing balance of payments problem that will occur even if the price of oil doesn't go up as it gets scarcer. And again, you would think that since economists are in plate proportions in Canberra, a few of them might have given the government the benefit of the traditional wisdom that as things get scarcer, they often get more expensive. There's a range of guesstimates of what might happen with future oil production, but they all involve the oil production peaking sometime around the next 10 years. And the best estimate of what the global oil production will finally look like is a curve something like this one produced by the Association for the Study of Peak Oil. The bottom line is that the best estimate of when world oil production will peak is about 2009. The pessimists think it has already happened. The optimists think it might be as far away as 7 or 8 years. But there's no fundamental disagreement with the geological fact that we are approaching, if we haven't already passed, the peak of world oil production, and it will get steadily scarcer and more expensive in the future. The most obvious replacement is gas, but the best estimate of when world gas production will peak is only about 35 years away. It's not a problem for me, but it is for some of the people in the room. I want to remind you, though, that there is no energy shortage, because the natural flows of solar, wind, geothermal, wave, tidal energy are literally thousands of times greater than human energy need. The factoid that I recall to focus attention on this is that the amount of solar energy that hits Australia alone in one summer day alone is about half the total global annual energy demand. I'll say that again because most people have difficulty believing it. The entire world, all 6.5 billion humans, in an entire year for all purposes, cooking, heating, lighting, washing, transport, use about twice the amount of energy that the sun delivers to Australia alone in one day alone. And the other natural flows of wind and wave and tidal and geothermal are similar in magnitude. There is no shortage of energy, but there is a critical shortage of the energy form which is most convenient for transport, because being a liquid fuel, it compresses much more energy into a much smaller volume than any other form. There are other resource issues that